Ladies and gentlemen, to all of you who are here in the gallery and to all of you who are joining us live on YouTube, I do want to tell you that we are going to just give it about 2 minutes just to ensure that everyone else who's joining us online can tune in and also be on time. So allow me to request 2 minutes of your time. Thank you very much. As we continue to wait for the 2 minutes, I assure you that those that are joining us live on YouTube will be questioning and asking if those in the gallery are wearing their masks. I stand in front of you now to confirm that I am looking around the room and everyone's got their masks on. So we are still following protocol. It's funny, and perhaps it is not funny, but if we think back that it was 2.5 years ago, roughly, that the word COVID-19 came to existence. And look how far we have gone as a country, look how far we have gone as institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start now. Thank you very much for joining us. And may I say that to those in the gallery and to all those that are joining us live on YouTube, wherever it is that you may be all around the world, I do want to say good morning to you, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so very much for joining us at this CPUT VC Africa Day public lecture with a theme that says Africanizing our universities as an academic project. And just to give you an idea of what you can expect today, I will be introducing myself a bit later on. We are going to be having Professor Chris Nhlapo, who's the Vice Chancellor here at CPUT, to give you an opening and also an welcoming. After that, we will be looking to hear from our guest speaker, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, who is from the Faculty of Education at UWC. And then we'll have some correspondences. Also, they are here in the gallery from Professor Andy Lemji, who's the Dean for Faculty of Education at CPUT, and Mr. Nanga Godana, who is the SRC President at CPUT. At the end of our of our proceedings, we will be having a response from Professor Driki Haiswema, who is the Executive Director for the Office of the Vice Chancellor at CPUT. My name is Wabungile Ganzelenzele. Once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so very much for joining us. Without further ado, I would like to call up to stage now the Vice Chancellor for the CPUT, that is Professor Chris Nhlapo, to welcome you and open the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Program Director, for the very kind introduction. Mr. Abongile Nzelenzele, Program Director, good afternoon. Our guest speaker, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, Executive Management, here present and online, all CPUT staff present and online, President of the Student Representative Council, Ms. Nanga Kodana, SG, Ms. Nonele Kanyile, and the entire student leadership, invited guests, daughters and sons of Africa. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Chris Nhlapo. I'm known as Nkongwani by others. Others call me Ngongwani. So it's a double-barrel surname. A name is a surname in my case. The two surnames, Nhlapo and Nkongwani, together. That is actually Nhlapo, Skekete, Nongombili, Ingaba Inye, Weza Nonina. Mabulala umuntu amhleke athi ngibulali ukhahlambana ndaba dubele mthende mlambo mveli wakamavundla akanamhlehlo akananyongo umhlehlo papakazi. Ladies and gentlemen, it's welcome to this momentous Africa Day celebration. As an institution, we have committed ourselves to Envision 2030. This vision speaks about exactly things that we are discussing here today. I will briefly focus on this one dimension of Smart University or Vision 2030. If you read it carefully, it's talking about a number of philosophies, African philosophy in particular, where we are talking about ukuhamba ungqiba ihlangu zomunye umuntu, to walk in somebody else's shoes. We are talking about ubunye. We are talking about ubuntu. We are talking about ukungafani. That's diversity. This Umbono 2030 is buttressed, among others, by the African Agenda 2063, which focuses on African citizenry. In particular, the African Virtual E-University, the African Commodity Strategy, the development of a continental free trade area, the African Outer Space Strategy. That's why, as an institution, we are the only university that has launched 3 satellites now in space, the last one being the one that was launched in California at SpaceX, because we are Pan-African University Space Science Institute, or PAUSI for short. As the largest university of technology in the Western Cape, and arguably the only smart university on the continent, the Cape Peninsula University of Technology has always understood its role as an African university. Not just as a university in Africa, or not only defined by geography, but the African university need to be reinvented with African discourses. And these are some of the discourses that we have been having, and of course today the focus is on African universities and how we can Africanize our university. This reminds me of a massive workshop that was actually hosted by Association of African University in Accra in July 1972, from the 10th to the 15th. And of course, there were 3 highly distinguished authors who were present at this workshop. And I will briefly share with you some of their perspective. I will start with Tijani Mamudu Yesefu, who was a professor at University of Benin, or UBen as they call it, and I will actually quote him. He said, "An African university must not only pursue knowledge for its own sake, but also for the amelioration of conditions of life and work of the ordinary men and women. It must be fully committed to active participation in the social transformation, economic modernization, and the upgrading of the total human resource of the nation," close quote. The second intellectual who was also there is Joseph Kizebo, a Burkinabe intellectual who was an African history professor at University of Ouagadougou between the period 1972 to 1978. And of course, I will also quote him around the whole question of African university, that it is not a new thing, it has been happening, but I think we are actually acting slow in terms of the Africanization of institutions of higher learning. He is actually saying Africanization of higher education curriculum calls for the liberation of universities from alien character. And now please underscore that, alien character. And we have seen at our university some of the alien tendencies creeping in. And of course, we were warned around 1972 around the alien character that is actually emerging at universities. And then of course, the third intellectual who was also at this workshop is Joseph Fistas Adenehi Ajehi, who is commonly known as JF Ade Ajehi, or JFA Ajehi, who was actually giving a paper on towards an African academic community. And he is actually positing that an African university must be diffused within their environment and must recognize more clearly the need of public accountability. And the discourse on engaged universities stemmed from this particular paper. And then, of course, as USAF, we also had a summit, Social Responsibility Summit last year, between the 3rd and the 5th of February. And the paper by Professor Ahmed Bauer, the CEO of USAF, also looked at this particular aspect of recalibrating the social ownership of universities. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that tells you a story that all this concept around an engaged university, around strengthening the social ownership of university, it's a debate that has been raging for a while. I think it's important that we have to pick those particular discussions and steam ahead. The questions that were posed by Professor Ahmed Bauer at that summit were the following. Are African universities part of the oppressive economic, political, and social superstructure in the continent? Who owns those universities? Do they know their students? How do they treat them and relate to them? What do they teach them? What is the future of those universities? And he made a call at that summit, and he argued strongly that there was an urgent need to establish a philosophical framework on ownership of African universities as public goods. Personally, I've also invested my entire career in strengthening the African education institution. And of course, I chaired what we called the mighty U6 or U6 Plus. And the founding members of the U6 Plus that I chaired is us, the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, the Jaramogi Oginga Odinga University of Science and Technology, which was formerly called Bondo University. It's one of the great universities in Kenya, named after the father of Raila Odinga. If you know Raila Odinga, the father, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. And of course, in Nigeria, Kwara State University, or Kwasu, as we call it, and the University of the Gambia, in the Gambia, and the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And of course, again, University of Ilorin, also in Kwara State. Across our faculties, our academics are drawing on the past while designing solutions for the future. And we saw this innovation in action during the past 2 years, when the continent's top scientists and researchers were at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic. And we know that there were expectations from certain quarters that this pandemic is going to ravage the continent. But we did not see that. And the big question is why? And I will actually tell you that there were some heavy reliance on indigenous knowledge system. We have seen our people using umhlonyane, for example, or lingana in South Sotho, which we call Artemisia afra, or Asterisai. And people were using Lisuku, or Alipedia amatimbika, in scientific term, or Apisia. We have seen our people using Patiangaka, or Hemania depressa, or Stidiculiciae in Latin. We all call for a Eurocentric mind. We all recall how Eurocentric minds were constantly surprised by the innovation and top scientific discoveries that were made on this continent. It was certainly a good wake-up call for the rest of the world about wealth of intelligence mind that we have at our disposal. The pandemic fight was a very different one to that which our revolutionary leaders fought, which was to free our beautiful continent from the yoke of colonialism. We honor these legends who took up the mantle of Pan-Africanism and who fought for the economic and political integration of Africa. And of course, there are two that stand out for me that I would actually like to quote. One is the first president of Ghana, a celebrated Pan-Africanist in Kwame Nkrumah. He is actually quoted as saying, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." Please underscore that forward. And of course, we have Marcus Garvey, and I quote, "Black men, you were once great, you shall be great again. Lose not courage or faith, go forward." So please underscore that forward. And I wanted to appeal to my students and staff that the time has come for CPUT to search forward. We have started a conversation to deal with some of the ills that we are seeing in societies. And I'm saying it is time that an institution, particularly my office, we have to lead from the front to ensure that we have this conversation and ensure that we change the life of people and strengthen our social contract. Decolonizing the higher education experience for our students and staff is embedded in our processes at CPUT. I view us as being on a journey of self-discovery, a journey that will have bumps in the road, but one that we are committed to. It is refreshing to see students drawing on their unique upbringing and experience to effect change through impactful research and innovation. We have recently concluded another successful graduation series, and listening to the interesting research topics make me confident in the crop of graduates and their ability to see South Africa and indeed Africa prosper. Our guest speaker, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, is an expert on this theme, and his exploration of the topic of Africanizing university will give us a greater insight into how we can do more to cement our heritage. I hope this learned lecture inspired the audience here and on a platform to recommit to the fundamentals of Africa Day, which is to celebrate our unity, our diversity, and our successes. In conclusion, Program Director, I want to quote Marcus Garvey again when he said, I quote, "You cannot grow beyond your thoughts. If your thoughts are those of a slave, you'll remain a slave. If your thought goes skin deep, your mental development will remain skin deep. Moreover, a doctrine of hate can never take people anywhere. It is too exacting. It wasps the mind. That's why we preach the doctrine of love, and love for Africa, love for Mother Continent. I hope you enjoy the rest of this program, and may God bless Africa and protect her people. Thank you, Enkosi Mawethu Ndiabulela. Happy Africa Day. Thank you.
If you have just joined us online on YouTube, you are live. This is the CPUT. This is Africa Day Public Lecture. Wherever you may be, we do want to say once again, good morning to you, good afternoon, and good evening. We're hoping that you have enjoyed the opening where the Vice-Chancellor of CPUT, Professor Chris Hlapo, was opening and setting the tone for the day. And certainly, now that you've spoken, VC, I understood that you said ubunye, that is unity, ubuntu, that is humanity, ukungafani, that is diversity. You were talking to say that it's all, or rather, it is not all about talking the talk, but there comes a time where you need to walk the walk. And the Cape Peninsula University, as a leading institution, not just in South Africa, but Africa, is saying it is the time to lead. Thank you so very much for that, VC, for sharing those kind of words for us. Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to give you an idea of where we are in the program now. We've just had the opening from the Vice-Chancellor. Coming up next, I'm going to be introducing our guest speaker for the day, a man who stands tall in front of me, and I'll share a little bit of a story with you just now. But also, a bit later on, we will be having some responses, that is from the SRC president and also from Professor Mji, who's the Dean for Faculty and Education. And then, of course, at the end, Professor Driki Heiswema will also be closing our session for us. That being said, it is my honor now to introduce our guest speaker here today. But I must tell you that there was a time, back in time, don't worry. It was back in the time of the old UPE. We were young students who believed we knew everything. No one could tell us anything. And there came this lecturer. He had dreadlocks then. They gave this lecturer in a communications class. Maybe before I tell you the story, you know, most in university, there are your A students. And then there's the rest of us, those who survive, who do what we can to get to the top of the tier. So in communications, I must say, it's the only class at university I ever got 90%. By the way, I tell you now that my lecture was Prof Simphiwe Sesanti. In that lecture, in fact, his first lecture, it was one lecture where I think for 1.5 hours, students spent crying because he came in on his first lecture, divided the lecture into two, and gave us a very, very difficult topic. I don't think he still remembers that. And he said, this side is going to discuss why apartheid was good for South Africa, and this side is going to discuss why apartheid was not good for South Africa. It was one of the toughest debates we've ever had as students. But the lesson that we got from that, from him, was that if you are going to be in communications, remember, emotions cloud the conversation. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our guest speaker for the day. It is a bit of a long bio, and certainly it needs to be a bit of a long bio. To you listening at home, Simphiwe Sesanti is a professor at the University of the Western Cape, that's UWC's Faculty of Education. He is a former editor for the International Journal of African Renaissance Studies. He holds 2 PhDs, one in journalism studies from Stellenbosch University on the political role of black journalists in a post-apartheid South Africa. The case of the City Press, if you remember, 1994 to 2004. Another PhD is in philosophy from Wits University with a title on African philosophy and the African Renaissance, a quest for a true humanity. He has taught at the Stellenbosch University's Journalism Department, at the Nelson Mandela University's Department of Journalism, Media and Philosophy, and at the University of South Africa's accredited journals at the University of South Africa's Institute for African Renaissance Studies. He has published and accredited journals on a variety of issues, including education, African philosophy, gender, journalism, politics, and spirituality with religion. He is an author of 2 books and a co-editor of one book and a contributor of chapters in a number of books. In 2018, he was awarded the NRF rating C2. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, our guest speaker for the day, Prof.
Igama likaQamata lakuhlala ingcwele. Igama lakhe lakuhlala linhloni ngokuba ungumdalo ongajongwayo ngokuba ungumdalo ongolathwayo. Sondele konike bokhokho sinqule konike eminyanya. Sithi izithethe zenu namasiko enu mawakhe igazi lethu. Thulani imithanjeni yethu ukuxabisa ugokwethu. Hlaziyani ezingqondweni zethu kuzazi basesisizwe. Delisani ilifu lomnyama ebomini bethu kuvele ukhanye. Sinike namathongo ahlambulukileyo ngawo osuze impilo nethamsanqa. Ngokuba amandla negunya lweni masitheni icamako. Camakisha kamnandi kweziwe sasemakhumazini zakwaqhenebeza kwaququza kwasithonga saru zakwaduka namahlale zakwamasitheni icamako. Sicamakisha kamnandi kwehlula semathonyeni zakwadikiza zakwasawa zakwankomo zakamthuzimele zakwachunga masitheni icamako. Sicamakisha kamnandi kwehlula semanqosini zakwacewa shotiti bonozinga abantu bomlambo ocewa shabesuthu masitheni icamako abantu bomlambo masitheni icamako. Sicamakishe kamnandi kwezohlula sematshaweni zakwachiwo zakwakhawuta zakwaphalo zakwadoko zakwapotobani zakwabalawa zawongonyamana zakwankosi yamntu masicamakisheni. Sicamakishe kamnandi kweziwe samantandini zokwasopicho zakwaYime zakwangobencoka zamazono zamaqhuba kadliwa dliwa simbuze enqulu komthirha kongobencoka omadibo vele bamdenzele masitheni icamako. Sicama kusheka manje kwezohlala zasemantakweni zakwaTyebele zakwaBintuka zakwalibele zakwaKhangashe masitheni camako. Izizwe sesithatheni zakwandebe zakwachithana zakwaKhophoyi masitheni camako. Ezamachawochi ukhawuto phalo utokobhoto manobulawo ngonyama nonkosi yamntu masitheni camako. Ezo zizwe semazangweni zakwaKhalo zakwaNcuthu zakwamlanjana zakwaSobese zakwangqele zakwakume zakumalitye zakwagula zakwanikwa namasitheni camako. Ezo zizwe zaziliqhiyo semambane zakwatshayingwa zakwampehla zakwambona oTyebele nto okhipha masitheni camako. Ezo zizwe semkhathini zomqolomba ekomkhulu edlukuvayo masitheni camako. Program Director, thank you very much. Greetings to everyone who is present. Mr. VC, Professor Mhlapo, Professor Mchi, and everyone present. Greetings to all of you. Please allow me by stating first and foremost that I address you in English under protest. Preferably, I would have loved to speak to you in my own language, isiXhosa. But because I'm conscious and cognizant of the fact that not everyone in this room speaks isiXhosa, therefore, I speak English. But even then, I would have preferred to speak in Kiswahili, a language that would unite all the African people, an African language. I do not understand why I should be speaking in English. I object intellectually and emotionally and spiritually to speaking that language, because that is a language that was established by sword. It is a language that was established by the gun. African people had to be killed and they died because they were forced to speak English. And therefore, I need to establish that I do not celebrate speaking English, because if I celebrate speaking English, it means that I celebrate the defeat of my ancestors. It would give the false impression that I celebrate that foreign language. I don't. English is simply an ethnic language. The fact that English is given an international status has got to do with imperialism, so that English was made international by force. All European languages individually are ethnic languages. This includes English, this includes Portuguese, this includes French, that today are regarded as international languages that have been a product and a result of colonialism. So if isiXhosa, isiZulu, Setswana, Sesotho are ethnic languages, they are no less ethnic than the English language. And it is important that we must establish this as an act of decolonization. And it is because Frantz Fanon told us that to declare negation is not negation. We can always declare whatever we want to declare, but it does not make us that which we declare. We can always declare that we are revolutionaries, but that does not make us revolutionaries. Declaring ourselves as revolutionaries does not make us revolutionaries. It is simply a declaration. And it is for this reason that I admire Gugulethu, who took a revolutionary decision, a conscious one, and said that instead of simply talking about the celebration of African languages when we meet together and have our necessities in conferences, Gugulethu made a conscious decision to begin to write in his own language, Gikuyu, and bid farewell to writing in English. Because Gugulethu understood something that was very important, and that being that language is not merely an instrument of communication. Language is a carrier of culture. It is a memory bank of history. It is our reference point to our past. And it is for this reason that when our brothers and sisters were taken into slavery in the US of A, the white people in that country forced them to stop to speak their own African languages. Because they understood that if these people continued to speak their African languages, then they would continue to remember what and who they are. Colonialism at that stage, imperialism, had a project. The project of imperialism was to inflict cultural amnesia on the African people, so that they would no longer have a sense of where they come from, a sense of their philosophy, a sense of their culture, a sense of their history. And thus began the project that Edward Blyden would later call the Europeanization of the African people. And the instrument of the Europeanization of the African people was through Eurocentric education. Not merely European, but Eurocentric. And at this point in time, we need to understand what we mean by Eurocentrism. And by Eurocentrism, we are referring to the redesigning of the world and remaking of a people and of all peoples in the image of Europe. In other words, the Europeans arrogantly took it upon themselves to take a godly role to recreate people and make them into the image of Europe. And that is a Eurocentric project. And so, in that fashion, the African people too were Europeanized. And the instrument in that was education. And so the African people were told that they were no longer African. They were the people of color. They were coloreds. And even to this very day, you hear African people without any sense of shrinking referring to themselves as people of color. And the question is, who in the world is not a person of color? Because all of us are people of color. We may be colored yellow, we may be colored green, we may be colored purple, we may be colored white, but all of us have color. But you see, Europeans understood that language is not merely a question of drama, it is a question of conceptualization. It is also a carrier of philosophy. And so we moved away from perceiving ourselves as African people. We were told that we were the people of color. And this was well understood by one of the best sons of the African continent, Bantu Biko, when he was standing in front of this judge or magistrate, and he looked at him and said, "But I think, Mr. Biko, that to me, you look more brown than black." And Bantu Biko smiled at him, and he said, "But I think, sir, that to me, you look more pink than white." Because in truth, in the world, there are no white people. And the white racists understood this, that because they were not white, they could not acknowledge the fact that others were black. And so it is for this reason that they began to refer to other people as non-white, so that the existence of others would always be measured against white people. Whiteness, whatever implication it may be, became the standard and the norm of measuring. And so we got another name, we became non-whites. And education made sure that it would do this. And so you would recall there's a beautiful book written by Alex Haley, telling us a story that when Alex Haley got there, when the African people got there, there was this young man whose name was Kunta Kinte. They told this man to drop his name, Kunta, and so that he could become Toby. He refused, they tortured him. He refused, they tortured him. He refused, they cut off his feet. And under torture, he accepted to be Kuntakin, to be Toby. The reason that Europeans did this was very conscious, because they understood that names of people and names of places are not merely names, but names carry a people's culture. Names carry a people's history. Names carry a people's aspiration. Names carry a people's frustration. It is for this reason that we know that when our children are named, they were named at a particular point in time, and we would know through their names that this is a particular event that took place. We would know that Nobahle is a reflection of beauty. Nontokozo is a reflection of joy. Bantu is a reflection of an expression that this young man will one day be a leader and spokesperson of his people. That Mangaliso is wonder. And therefore, we were expected as children that we would be a fulfillment of the aspirations of our ancestors. And education, Eurocentric education, was utilized to remove all that. Because when children began to attend school, they were told when they were accepted that they had to discard their heathen names, which were African names. And they had to adopt Christian names, when in fact the so-called Christian names have never been Christian, because Jesus Christ was not European. Jesus Christ did not speak English. He did not speak Portuguese. He did not speak French. Jesus spoke Hebrew. But miraculously, in our schools, Jesus became English, and Christian names became English, French, and Portuguese. And the schools did that. And so in the schools, after the defeat, we were made to think that European languages are languages. That's why we are told that English is the language of business. English is the language of commerce. Hiding the fact that English is today a language of commerce, a language of business, because the British dispossessed peoples wherever they went, and they took over their economies. And after having subdued the people of those places and took over their economies, they reduced them into being slaves. And in order for these people to be able to live, they had to speak the language of the master. And that was English. And today, as professors, we tell our students that they must master English, because English is the language of international communication, English is the language of business, English is the language of commerce. And we do not tell them that, in fact, English is a language of imperialism. Because we, ourselves, as professors, are the product of colonialism. We continue to be very colonial. Colonialism goes deep. And in 2015 and 2016, beginning with the Rhodes Must Fall movement and the Fees Must Fall movement, students began to demand a decolonized and Afrocentric education. And the question was, how is it that in 2015, so many years after 1994, and so many years after many, many years for the rest of Africa, were the students demanding a decolonized education, when we were speaking about a post-colonial Africa? This explains that what many of us have not understood, we fail to distinguish between colonization and colonialism. Because colonization refers, as Professor Nhlapo was saying earlier on, Professor Mpleto made a very important point. He was saying that when we speak of an African university, we distinguish between an African university and a university in Africa. Because a university in Africa is one that is geographically located in Africa. but it does not necessarily carry the spirit of the philosophy of Africa, which is what an African university should be. But now the truth of the matter is that we do not have African universities, we have universities in Africa. Because our universities are merely located geographically in Africa, but they do not carry the spirit, the soul, and the philosophy of the African continent. And so the students were raising. So then we need to remind ourselves that colonization refers to the geographical location, but colonialism refers to a displacement of a people's culture, philosophies, and values, and a replacement of those by the colonizer. So that the colonizers, even though they retreated physically and allowed African people to have presidents, prime ministers, to have flags and everything else, they continue to occupy the mental space of the African people. So colonialism remains, because language being a carrier of culture, we behave in a way that we were expected to be. And it is for this reason that Woodson, in his book, he wrote this book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And he was saying, and of course this point was reiterated later by many like Amy Césaire, that once you occupy the mind of a person, let me put it in the Amy Césaire way, which is more often than not attributed to Bantu Biko, that the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed in their hands. Because when you control a person's mind, that person will do anything and everything that you want her or him to do without even telling him or her to do so, because her or his mind is captured. And so it is for this reason that even as the colonialists symbolically withdrew, they had made sure through their education that they had miseducated us in such a way effectively that we would continue to be Europeans, even though we have our beautiful black skin colors, even though we wear what we refer to as African dress, but our minds, our spirits, and everything else continues to be European. And it is for this reason, and I'm glad that the Secretary of the SRC is here and together with the President, because this has been a very fascinating phenomenon for me, that these young people came on the scene in 1915, and they were beginning to say that they were demanding a decolonized education. But interestingly, the very same young people, they were trying to outsmart one another in speaking about epistemology, in speaking about hermeneutics, in speaking about the paradigm shift, in speaking about ontology, in speaking about, which is another one, it's ontology, it's metaphysics, it's hermeneutics, it's paradigm shift, because they had these terms when they came into university, even when it was unnecessary to do so. And this phenomenon was explained by Fanon. And Fanon said, amongst the Negroes, you cannot find more people who have a deep inferiority complex than the educated people. The educated people are the ones who carry the most inferiority complex. It is because it is not by default, but by design. The educated were miseducated in such a way that they would always look up to the European people, that they would like to speak English, French, and Portuguese more than those people do themselves, so that even when, in the form of the students who were demanding a decolonized education, whilst on one hand they were calling for decolonization, on the other hand they were busy colonizing themselves by speaking English through a bombastic way. And it is for this reason that Fanon said, you see, to declare negation is not in itself negation. To declare yourself a decolonizer is not in itself a decolonizing act. It is completely something different. Decolonization is real. And I'm happy that, I'm very fascinated, Professor Nhlapo, that I've seen that the secretary this time around of the SRC is a woman. General Secretary head. That's how it was put to me, General Secretary. It was not Assistant Secretary. Because the tendency within, even in the political movements, I was noticing with the developments, if you look at Eastern Cape, the same pattern has happened in the ANC. You have the chairperson, you have the deputy, you have the general secretary, then you have the assistant secretary. The assistant secretary is a woman. In Mpumalanga, the same trend. We had the same trend even nationally. You have the president who's a man, you have a deputy president who's a man, you have the national chairperson. At least that position at one stage was twice occupied by a woman, but the ANC reversed and had a chairperson who's a man, you have the general secretary who's a man, you have an assistant secretary who's Jesse Duarte. Racism and sexism are twins. The two are inseparable. In Europe, the colonialists did not only bring through education racism, but also sexism. Because in their history, in their culture, in their education, they are patriarchs. They were patriarchs. And for this, go study or read at least a portion in Aristotle's book, The Politics. And you will be told that women and children in that culture were not regarded as citizens. It was only men. It is in that culture that even today, many of us do not realize that the Roman culture is such that in European culture, the husband owns the woman, his wife. He owns his daughters. And symbolically, when a woman gets married, it is the father that holds the daughter and walks up to the husband, thus symbolically transferring the ownership from the father to the husband. And we African people do that with our eyes open. It's through education. You are continuing to be Europeanized, even as you claim to be decolonized, because your education has entrenched that. It is for this reason that when a woman gets married to a Sesanti, she no longer remains a Kyolwan. She becomes a Sesanti because she is now being co-opted into this family. She loses her identity. It is a European tradition, not an African tradition. Because women are regarded as inferior. Women are regarded as substandard. So, Professor said, if then we mean business, when we say we want to, and I want to say this point here, I'll come back to it. But please, Prof, when I'm left, if I don't talk about it, my time will end at 22. Ms. Cholana gave me 45 minutes. I'm very sensitive about time. So please remind me too, Chair, and say, you are left with 5 minutes. Go back to that point of Africanization and ReAfricanization, because it's a very important point. Now, we do all these things. If then we are serious, because in African culture we know that a woman remains a mampondo mise even when she gets married. She does not belong to the other clan. She continues with their own identity. But the European imperialist tradition is always to rename and to misname. It is for this reason when they came here, they renamed all over the place. They called that one Grahamstown, they called that one this, King Williamstown, they called that one this, and they gave us European names. The Arabs followed in the tradition as well. In the name of Islam, Simphiwe is not good enough, you must be Suleiman. And that is called Christian education, it is called Islamic education, it is called all of that. And so, Prof Nhlapha, these are the issues. Because for as long as a people do not know what and who they are, they cannot become what they wish to be on their own terms. And you see what they did then in our schools to this very day. When you study philosophy in our institutions of learning, what we are told is that, in fact, the first philosophy of education, it is traced to Plato. And yet Plato came to Kemet, ancient Egypt, and studied there. The records tell us that the surviving book, the oldest surviving book in the world, not only in Africa, are the teachings of Ptahotep. The teachings of Ptahotep were published between the year 2004, 2500 and 2400 before the Common Era. It was there. We have the instructions of Amanomepe. We have the instructions of Ani, which Mary Lichtheim calls in a 3-volume ancient Egyptian literature, the didactic literature. And yet when we in our faculties of education teach teachers the didactics, we give them Eurocentric philosophy. We tell them, but it is not our sin. It is only because that's what we were told. But we must not make that excuse anymore. Because we have had scholars such as Edward Blyden. Edward Blyden was courageous in raising this issue. Many people focus on the little part that Edward Blyden raised in terms of elevating Christianity, because at the time he thought that at that time African people did not have their own. But Edward Blyden cut ties with that in 1908 by publishing the book African Life and Customs, where he made it very clear that the African people were leaders in spirituality. And Edward Blyden did not have to say that. The Bible itself says so in the Acts, that Moses, those of you who are intelligent enough and hold skills, quickly Google it. Moses said, in the Acts it is said, Moses learned his wisdom from the Egyptians. He learned it there. From black people, from the African people. We were leaders in this regard. And it is important that I make reference to this point, and in terms of racism and sexism, Professor Ntlap. And this is that. In the tradition of the African people, we are told that God is both female and male. God is neither female nor male, and there is no contradiction. Our ancestors made this point because they recognized that there is a complementarity between women and men. So that when feminism raises issues about equality between women and men, it is a point that our ancestors had already made, because when in Memphis, they refer to the creator as a mother. Bta. In Memphis. In Heracleopolis, they referred as Ra, as mother and father. And they said these gods created, in the story of creation, they created Shu, which is the air, male component. Tafnut, which is moisture, the female element. Reb, yeah, down, Reb, the earth. And above Nut, the sky, female element. Isis and Osiris, Nephthys and Seth. And they gave birth. And so they say, our ancestors, the person who brought evil into the world was a male, because he was jealous of his brother Seth, being jealous of his brother Osiris. This is the story of creation of the African people. And they say this brother dismembered, he cut his brother into pieces. And it was a woman, Isis, a woman who went out and collected all the pieces of her husband and put them together. And Kizebo tells this story. Kizebo, amongst others. You mentioned Kizebo, our brother. He says, now there's a symbolic statement in this woman bringing together these pieces of a dismembered. Because as the Ohafia language tells us in Nigeria, that a man's penis scatters. We see when we throw water, it goes in all direction. And when we also make love, our sperms go in all direction. But it is the woman's womb that gathers. Literally. When men through their ego destroy the world, it is always women who must reconcile and bring together. And this is the teaching of our ancestors. This is the education of our ancestors. And so, you have not yet reminded me, Chair. Still far. And so, yeah, Professor Chair, when we say Africanize, sometimes this is mistaken as a move of taking that which is European and making it African. Because we've been made to think that literacy, the writing began in Europe. But the truth of the matter is that the writing began in Africa. And so it has got to be standard practice that when students, in fact, later on, it will be taught right down there. But as a beginning, there is no student who comes at the first year level who should not know that writing began in Africa, that our ancestors taught that women and men were equal, but women even more. Because I'm wearing, and many people think that I'm wearing a cross. This is an ankh, a symbol of ancient Egypt, Kemet. Many would describe this. They say this is the womb, and this is the waistline, and this is the rest. Because our ancestors have taught us what all of us have seen. None of us have ever witnessed, none of us has ever witnessed a woman coming out of a man's rib. It is a particular text that tells us that women came from the rib below women's armpits. Below men's armpits, they came from there. None of us has ever seen that. I'm willing to give all that I have to anyone who says she or he has ever witnessed a man, a woman coming out of a man's rib. But certainly, our ancestors they continue to teach us that the first home of all human beings is a woman's womb. So women at the beginning, and it is for this reason that we are told that the earth is the mother womb. So from women we come, and to Mother Earth we return. The women at the beginning and the women at the end of it all. None of us, except of course through that process which at far, were transported part of us from the man's body. But we know all of us have come through this way, through the women's gateway, and that is the vagina. All of us, without exception. And so, that is our education. This is our philosophy. And so I was saying that when then we speak, rather than saying we are advancing Africanization of universities, I propose that we use the language that was used by Amilcar Cabral, amongst others. Amilcar Cabral, instead of speaking about Africanization, he spoke about ReAfricanization. Because when we do so, we are recreating ourselves. We are re-giving birth to ourselves, as to destroy the notion, the false notion, that we want to become Africans who are taking what is European and putting on an African garb. This is the difference between Africanization and ReAfricanization. And so, therefore, this is what we seek to do through the ReAfricanization of education, the ReAfricanization of the university. We are claiming, or rather reclaiming, our souls as African people. And in doing this, we are not, as some are claiming. And they ask us, how are we going to do in terms of the curricula? And this is what we must address. Are you going, because this is always their concern, even the Africans ask, are you going to do away with William Shakespeare? Are you going to do away with Plato? Are you going to do away with Aristotle? We say no. We have no reason to do away with Plato. We have no reason to do away with Aristotle. We have no reason to do away with Isocrates. We have no reason to do away with Herodotus. Because when we do away with any of this literature, we will be discarding our own heritage as African people. Because when we advance these truths that we are the leaders of society, we do not make false claims. We refer to Herodotus, that Greek historian who is highly revered by the European world. And Herodotus tells us that the Greeks took the names of their gods from ancient Egypt, that the Greeks took their education from ancient Egypt, that the Egyptians had specialists in everything, that it was the ancient Egyptians, dentists, that were trusted by the Greeks themselves. We refer to Plato in his book, The Laws. And Plato in his book, The Laws, says, the Greeks must yet master the doing of mathematics. The Greek adults must yet learn to master mathematics in the way that the children, adults, must yet master doing mathematics in the way that children in Egypt are doing. It's in the laws. Plato, in the laws, not me. Right? It's Plato. Says this. Not me. Plato. And Isocrates, who was a contestant of Plato, writes that the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, emulated the laws, the political science, the legal science of the ancient Egyptians. And it is for this reason that Herodotus says he observed amongst the Lacedaemonians a particular habit of children standing up so that adults must sit down. And he said amongst the Greeks, he had only seen this amongst the Lacedaemonians. And again, you have to read Isocrates and Herodotus in order to establish the link. The reason that Herodotus had only seen this in ancient Egypt and amongst the Lacedaemonians is because, as Isocrates says, they learnt it from the ancient Egyptians. And so we shall not say, therefore, that our children must do what the Europeans did in their Eurocentric narrow-mindedness. They came here, found the people, imposed their English and Afrikaans, and did not want to speak African languages. Today they struggle, they can't communicate, they're monolingual or bilingual. African people are multilingual, we speak isiXhosa, isiZulu, and all of that. And so, we shall not tell our children not to study. They must study European history. They must study European literature. They must study everything, but study themselves first. Get to know themselves, because it is only that way that you shall be able to contest Eurocentric domination. When you know that which is about you, but you also know that which other people know about themselves. And so, the ReAfricanization of education then, program director, is the reclamation, so that even then we hear that there's a language that speaks about being reborn, the born agains. That concept of being reborn, we get it in the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Because the African people believed, as they continue to do so now, that when the soul departs or parts with the flesh, life continues. You become reborn. And it is from there that we derive the concept African Renaissance. Contrary to the view that we are again imitating the Europeans who spoke about the Renaissance of the arts. It is only in the 16th or 17th century, but we spoke about that concept thousands of years before the Common Era. And so, this is what we mean by ReAfricanizing. We are therefore, my 8 minutes remaining, I'm very sensitive to time. It's our ancestors, you see. They even invented the concept of time. They invented the concept of the calendar, of mathematics. So they did not understand when the African people were not being punctual, it was simply a statement of protest. And of course, I know that they probably did not read this, but it's available that psychologist, Manganyi, he wrote the biography, The Making of a Psychologist. It's a psychological issue. It's not so much that Africans do not prioritize. Otherwise, we would not have been successful farmers who understood the movement of the moons and the sun and all of that. We knew. We were successful in that long before. But we began not to pay attention to time because we realized that whatever we were doing was not for ourselves. We were doing everything and anything for others. And so they began to take a slow pace and to ignore time. And in their arrogance, they then said, we have no concept of time. Narrow-mindedness. But we cannot take responsibility for that. When they took away the language of the African people in America, they wanted them to forget. They wanted them to forget concepts. But even as they allowed us to speak our own African languages, the European languages became dominant. We began to refer to our own brothers and sisters as foreigners. When you look into the language of the Kikuyu, they call the bird nyoni. It is the same word for isiZulu. Amongst the Tanzanians who speak Kiswahili in East Africa, they tell you in Swahili, taonana kesho. Listen to that language, kesho, gomso. A child would say, gosho, zobona gosho. We are one people. Unotoka wapi, uvelapi. Novua hani in Shangan, nivuke njani. Mamuka, say in Sishwana. But we began to refer to one another as Europeans, as foreigners. And there is no sense of shame because we've been made poor people. Not only did they impoverish us physically, they impoverished us mentally as well. We kill one another because we want to go and be slaves. We say, our African brothers and sisters are taking our jobs. We are not demanding our land back. We are not telling our exploiters to stop turning us against one another. We rush to kill one another because we all want to go and get crumbles from the master. Because we learned a new language. The language that said, your fellow brother and sister is a foreigner. It is important. So on this day of Africa Day, we remember that this year is the 100th anniversary of Julius Mwangambwage Nyerere, who told us, Mr. Vice Chancellor, that whilst we politicians are busy with day-to-day issues, unable to think deeply because there is no time, we have haste, it is the responsibility of educators, the responsibility of professors, the responsibility of academics to reflect deeply about the kind of education that is going to remind African people that they are one people all over the African continent. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, I noticed in the invitation, they were saying the VC's Africa Month, Africa Day lecture. And I'm very proud of you that you've taken this project of Africa Day right into the office of the VC, prioritizing our responsibility. You have heeded the call by Julius Nyerere, and I thank you for that. Many of us do not know, Mr. VC, that Julius Nyerere was not merely a politician. Julius Nyerere was a philosopher. Not only because Julius Nyerere thought philosophically, but also he studied philosophy. It is no accident that even when the traitors had betrayed and overthrew Nkrumah in 1969, that there was that conference you were referring to in 1972. Because Nkrumah was a philosopher leader. Even as they had removed him, his influence remained. And it is for this reason that that conference took place in the same way that the first conference of the All-African People's Convention took place there in 1958, where Lumumba, where Fanon, where all of them met. And in this 1 minute program direct, when they tell us that Pan-Africanism is an illusion, tell them that it is them that are illusory. Because we know that in East Africa, Tanzania and Zanzibar, one separate entities, united under Nkrumah. That Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Modibo Keita and Sekou Toure had formed a union of African states before the traitors and those who were against us overthrew him. That when the traitors had overthrown Kwame Nkrumah, Nkrumah not understanding French in Guinea, he saw the crowds clapping. The crowds were clapping. He didn't understand because Sekou Toure had declared that if these traitors have removed you as the head of state, I'm stepping down and you are becoming the head of state in Guinea. And when they tell us that our leaders are power hungry, we point them to Sekou Toure, who stepped down. And Nkrumah said, no, I cannot take this, so rather I will be a co-president. Long live the African revolutionary spirit of Pan-Africanism. Long live. We will win. We will triumph sooner than later.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are sitting at home trying to make sense, digesting, trying to look back to what you've just heard, it's all the same also in the gallery here. I'm looking at eyes that are gazing at me as if I have the answers, as they've just listened to our guest speaker for the day. That is Professor Simphiwe Sesanti from the Faculty of Education at UWC. My goodness. I also have to now recollect myself and get into the zone once again. To you, if you have just joined us, once again, we dare say to you, wherever it is that you may be in the world, good morning to you, good afternoon to you, and good evening to you. Thank you so very much for joining us for this CPUT's VC's Africa Day public lecture with the theme saying that there's a need of Africanizing our universities as an academic project. And certainly, as our guest speaker said right now, that the Vice Chancellor of CPUT is taking responsibility and accountability and saying it's not just about talking the talk, it is time now to walk the walk also. And certainly, you may be asking what was said since you joined in, maybe you joined in later. I promise you too much was said, but I do believe that if you request some of these recordings, you can get them, and it will also be there on YouTube. Do yourself a favor, go check it out on YouTube, because we are still trying to digest it. And may I say, it was very difficult for me for once to ask a guest to come off stage. I wanted him to stay on stage. He wanted to come off stage. It was a whole tussle that was happening. But if you want me to try and summarize what the good prof said, and by the way, there is a whole lot to this. He talks to the fact that Africanizing is not about taking away. It's about adding more. He talks to the fact that, and you will have to go back once again and check on these, declaring yourself a revolutionarist does not make you a revolutionalist. I need to get that word right. Also, he talks to the fact that language is a carrier of culture. And he talks to the fact that we have universities in Africa, but not African universities. And lastly, he says names, African names, carry people's history and people's culture. And I look to his name and I laugh. Simphiwe. He is a gift to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to proceed, otherwise we would stay here for the whole day with this. Just once again to recap on what you've been looking at for the program. A reminder that my name is Wabongile Ganzelenzele. Thank you for joining us. We've had the opening where our Vice-Chancellor from CPUT, Professor Chris Dapo, opened the proceedings for us. And then we've just had a wonderful, wonderful guest speaker, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti. We are now looking to get some responses from those that are in the gallery. I am going to be calling up firstly Professor Andy Lemji, who's the Dean for Faculty of Education at CPUT, to share some words with you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. You know, sometimes you find yourself having to follow some of the best and you wonder, will I be as eloquent? You know, the program of the day says Africanizing our universities as an academic project. I think what we've accepted, Professor Sesanti, is that you're quite right. Let's re-Africanize our universities, because there's a lot of acknowledgement that the language, mathematics, philosophy comes from Africa. We've been suppressed, we've been denied, we've been made to think that no, all these things we learnt from Europe, and yet all the history was taken away. And the Greeks have, as you say, have acknowledged it in their writings. I think one of the most important issues you've raised today is how we've minimized our own languages, you know, to the betterment of English. We've got parents today who look at their children and say, oh, my child is very good. They know English. English does nothing. It does not give them the cultural perspective, the self-identity, you know, the history, the everything. It is important then that we look at our languages again. You know, I was asking the president of the SLC his clan name. And then it reminded me of a book, you know, Jalalamawel. So I asked him thereafter, do you read Xhosa books? Because Xhosa books carry exactly what you were talking about, the culture, the history, who we are, where we come from. And all these are critical. And the unfortunate thing is that us as parents, by the way, don't even give the children the books that we read at school. The stories, the culture that is embedded in those books, we don't give them. So we, unfortunately, ourselves, you know, have made our languages less ethnic and made English more the language of our discourse. That is why it's important then that we re-Africanize. I certainly agree with you in that respect. We also obviously have this issue that you've raised again. We think that by howling in the air, we really are that. For example, you said, we like to see ourselves as revolutionaries, and therefore declare ourselves as revolutionaries, which necessarily does not mean that we are, because the same example of English. We want to be revolutionaries, but we want to be English people. And we talk about, oh no, we want colonialism. Let's put everything back and Africanize. But everything and thought process we do is Anglicized, is Europeanized. You talked about Kunta Kinte, how he was tortured, how he had to forget his history because he's got to be called differently. I'll go back to the brother. I was very fortunate to have grown up and met this man. You will know who he is, but I'm just going to read what he said. I'm going to be me as I am, and you can beat me, or jail me, or even kill me, but I'm not going to be what you want me to be. Steve Biko. I was very lucky, as a young boy, because when I grew up in Port Elizabeth, he was a friend of Pani Pichana. So, growing under him, Pani Pichana, I had a chance to meet this man. This is extremely important. Our universities should try and leave our students be. Let them be. Let them be thinkers. Let's not change them to have colonial minds. No, let them be. Let's give them, let's assist in the wisdom they carry. Today in education, we are of the view that we should center learning around the students, not around myself being this professor who professes everything, who thinks he knows everything, because is there anybody who knows everything? No, we don't know everything. Therefore, let the learning be centered around our students. Let it be learning and teaching, not the other way around. When you and me went to school, obviously, we were told and taught everything. We had these people who knew everything, and therefore who would tell us what we should know and what we shouldn't know. Which is why, for example, today, we have children who think that mathematics is so remote and far away from them. It fascinates because you go anywhere virtually in Africa, you see people build rondavelts. How is that possible that ancient Africans have been building rondavelts all this time? And when we teach our children mathematics, we just come and say, oh, the area of this, remember now, this is a cylinder, that round object. The area of this is a 2 pi r squared h. The Africans have been building these houses for years. Why were they not falling? Why were they standing there? Because they knew the mathematics around this cylinder we're talking about, which is the house. We've been building crawls, cylinders. And all these things, there's also a significance about them, by the way. They are secular because we've always been about oneness. You must see everybody in the African culture. So all these happen because we sit around, for example, a fire. Or if we are sitting in a crawl, we sit around the dishes that are going to be shared. Oneness, Professor, I'm so happy that CPUT looks at oneness because African people believe in oneness. We have always believed in oneness. Then the other issue is, I have to come into this, how we handle our women. You know, we've got major issues in this day of gender-based violence. It is unbelievable that we are also involved in this. It is a scourge that we should get out of as quickly as possible. It's funny how, you know, when I think about all the people I've loved in this world, it's funny, it's not my mother, it's my grandmother, you know. It's always been around my mother, my grandmother, my mother's sisters. And yet, today, you can see, you know, the colleagues, I'm a mirror image of, you know, all other families. But why then? Who's taught us then to disrespect women? This is something us as universities in our ReAfricanization should look at. Let's stop it. Let's stop it. It is not worth it to ill-treat women. Be it women you know and women you do not know. You know, Desmond Tutu says, differences are not intended to separate, to alienate. We are different precisely in order to realize our need of one another. You talked about how we'll ill-treat our brothers from the African continent, how we ill-treat each other, by the way, on the basis of race, you know. All these things, you know, when you look at a puzzle, you have oneness because the pieces come in different shapes. Not because they are the same, because if they were the same, remember, they would be moving away from each other as you place them. But it means then our differences create the complementarity that we need for us as a human species to survive in this earth. It is important, therefore, that we embrace diversity. And that's what this university is about, by the way. We embrace diversity. We do not say, oh, you're different from us. We don't need you. We need you. We need your expertise. We need your know-how. We need the history of where you come from to make us wiser on what we already know from our own perspective. You know, you talked about the concept of time. You talked about the stars, the moon, and everything. And you reminded me that the concept of time has always been with us, actually. Because look at how the Xhosas name the months. Mdumba, Mqungu Mdumba. It's because we look at the occasions. What happens then? Umga. What happens? Ngomga. We know. Umgu yakhula. It starts growing. Chazimbuns. What happens to the animals? So all these things are time-based. So the concept of time, we've always had it. So I certainly agree with you on all these issues. And therefore, you know, I feel that our university should indeed carry the spirit and the souls and the values of Africa if we, as universities in Africa, are going to survive. You know, the Sontonga's song ends with Makube njalo, Makube njalo. Sabula.
Thank you so very much for those wonderful, lovely, lovely words. That is Professor Andile G, Dean for Faculty of Education at CPUT, responding to some of the words that were put forward by our guest speaker, that is Professor Simphiwe Sesanti. To you listening at home, joining us on YouTube and also in the gallery, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'll continue keeping greeting because we never know who's just arrived into the party, if you want to call it that. But this is the CPUT's VC's Africa Day public lecture with the theme Africanizing our universities as an academic project. And so we've had the VC opening for us, and our guest speakers have said, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, sharing one or two words. And then just now, Professor Andy Lemji, as I've said, also coming out to share his views on that specific speech. And I took note of some of your words talking about being African and also the whole issue of gender-based violence. And I was tying it to what the VC had said in the beginning, that, CPUT is at the forefront of leading now, in that talking the talk is done. It's time to walk the walk. And I can tell you that preview was party to a session they had a couple of weeks back, where it was a gender-based violence crucial conversation with the theme masculinity and manhood in eradicating gender-based violence. That was an initiative, I believe, that was pushed forward by the VC. Also, one of those initiatives that I was privy to is that they were, as an institution, they are starting with he for she ambassadors. So, once again, CPUT standing in front and saying, we're talking the talk, but now it's time to walk the walk. We continue with our program for the day. Thank you so very much for joining us. We're hoping that you're enjoying the session so far. Talking about students, talking about leaders, we must also hear from our leaders. Hey, VC, no, I'm not talking about you now. We are talking about our leaders now. Ladies and gentlemen, up next also to share their views, perhaps the views of the students in looking into the speech that was brought to us by our guest speaker. I'd like to call up to the stage now the SRC president at CPUT, that is Mr. Nanga Odana.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and Bulise, to the Vice Chancellor, the Deans, the entire Office of the Vice Chancellor, and special greetings to our guest, Prof. We really appreciate having you here. It was a very, very great speech, conscious speech that you have delivered here, and you bring us back to our roots, because at times we live this life and adapt to things that are not of our own culture and of how we're even raised by our parents. But at some point we find ourselves in that part of life. But it is always good when we meet people like you who will remind us of our roots, people who can speak to our consciousness so that we stay awake and we don't shy away from our own cultures. I want to thank the VC, most importantly, for having this lecture. It's a very, very important one. And I must say, Prof, that the speech that we have delivered here have emphasized on things that we've been rhetoric about as student leadership. You have mentioned one thing that I believe is very much important, which is language. When you get to a university as a student, first thing you get, it's a paper, which is a policy, which is rules and regulations, constitutions, statute. And we must say that as the student leadership, from what we have delivered here, we want to look at the issue of language in the discussion of it being a policy. We want to challenge the university that if we are to be really practical about Africanizing the institution, let's first deal with the policy, which is the one that governs the institution itself. We are not going to come here and gather a VC in these lecturers, but when we walk out, we are still subjected to the very same issues that we are saying we have gathered here for. We want this lecture, or perhaps this Africanizing of the institution, it must be documented. It must be a policy that everyone, be it a staff member, a student, it must be something that is documented, that we are to be a totally transformed institution. We are to be an Africanized institution in practical, not only in rhetoric. We have mentioned an issue of decolonization, that we must not only just declare ourselves as revolutionaries, but we are not acting anything. We've been to strikes, we've been to the fees must fall, only declaring ourselves as revolutionaries. But when it comes to practicality and implementation, we just take a step back. I'm saying this because indeed, Prof, you are correct when you say we must walk the walk. We are done with talking. If we are to be really pushing this agenda of total transformation and decolonization, let's look at the university itself, the residences, the streets, the names, because if we are to Africanize this institution, we must look at how do we then review the names of our residences. It can't be that we are pushing an agenda to Africanize the university, but even the names of our residences are not named after our pro-African people. We must see that we push the agenda of transformation to an extent that even residences are named after our own African people. We must, we are going to challenge this through the relevant committees to have totally decolonized institution through naming even the residences. I must feel African even where I stay as a student if we are to Africanize the institution. Same applies to catering, because we need practicality here. Catering of the institution, I'm talking about cafeterias and stuff, it must be also speak to the diverse culture of our own CPUT and African at large. And before I sit down, I think we must, as being practical, create, firstly, we need to strengthen the arts and culture department. We need to see more activities that will speak to the diverse culture of the CPUT community we are. We haven't seen much of the arts and culture department doing these programs, because I believe it should have been something that is continuous, because it's only a lecture today, but tomorrow there is nothing, there's going to be silence. And we go back to this Prophet. Hence I was saying that we forget these things because we only come and gather once and there is no continuity, there is no consistency. We want to challenge, as the student leadership, the Arts and Culture Department, to have more of this discussion, create platforms for us to come and express our own Africanism. That is what we want to put very much radicality there, VC, so that the Arts and Culture Department must bring programs, must allow us, give us platforms, be it online, be it gatherings, but we must be given a platform to express our cultures. As before I sit down also, we must, VC, have these lectures continuously so that you give us the chance to celebrate and highlight the strides and achievements that we as the university, what have we done so far in terms of pushing this agenda of Africanizing the university. As students, we need to hear it from the institution that this is what is happening in terms of this, how far we went, so that we celebrate and we understand clearly what it is needed. Lastly, we must also, in pushing this agenda of Africanizing, we want to see a clinic that will have these traditional herbs that speaks to our own African. We want to see umhlonyane at the clinic. If I don't want the panado that I'm being offered there, I must be and have an opportunity to say, I want that mhlonyane, I want that. And there must be more of our African people being employed in these things where we need to express our culture. With that, I want to thank you so much for this lecture, and I thank you so much, Prof, for such a wonderful speech. Thank you so much. Enkosi kakhulu.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I've always wondered this insanity of being part of the SRC. You know, when you're part of the SRC, you've got your whole academics right there in front of you. You've got the stresses like any other student. They are there. Just because you're in the SRC, they don't move away. But here you are. You volunteer yourself and you say, call me, I will lead. I suppose, Mr. President, we just want to say to you and your team, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for your service as students and as leaders in our institutions. Thank you so very much for that. To you, joining us from wherever it is that you may be joining us, you were listening to the voice of the CPUT SRC President, that is Mr. Nanga Godana. We are reaching the tail end now of our program. Maybe just once again to greet you and say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever it is that you may be. With that being said, I do want to remind you where we've been to get to this point. You are at the CPUT's VC's Africa Day public lecture with the theme Africanizing Our Universities as an Academic Project. We've had the opening speech from Prof Chris Klapo, who is the Vice Chancellor at CPUT. We then had our guest speaker, Professor Simphiwe Sesanti, sharing his thoughts on Africanizing our universities. And then we've had Professor Andile Mg, who's the Dean for the Faculty of Education at CPUT, sharing their responses to the speech. And then, as you've just heard now, the SRC President sharing the views of the students. We continue now to the last item that is on our programs. That is, we're going to be having some concluding remarks. That is from Professor Driki Swema, who is the Executive Director for the Office of the VC at CPUT.
Thank you so much, Program Director. I'm actually very honored because I'm the only female here that have the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Maybe next time we can do better on that one. Nonetheless, it's my privilege to just do a vote of thanks and maybe to share with you some one or two observations or my own reflections of this afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, Prof Nhlapo, for his introductory speech. We see it's always so good to listen to you, words of wisdom. The proverbs that you have used here, I love proverbs, especially African proverbs, and they were so meaningful in the context of the conversation as well. Prof Simphiwe, I don't have words. I actually feel I wanted to sit this afternoon and just continue listening to your words of wisdom. You're really a fountain of wisdom, and I've learned so much. Nonkosi, we must again invite the professor to speak also to our children, our sons and daughters at the university. Our respondents, Prof Mg, I always, if someone asks me who's Prof Mg, I say that's the man with the golden voice. He just has this wonderful voice. Always impressed. Thanks for your response, so well captured as well. And then President Nanga Godana, you know, sometimes I think students are just having fun, but when I listen to someone like you, and I can see how you have intellectually engaged with this topic of today, I'm proud of you, and we are proud that you are the SRC leader. Then our broadcaster and our program director. It's wonderful to have someone leading the events, so comfortable, so good at what he's doing. We are really honored. And obviously you know his name by now, Abongile Zelenzele. MCD for helping us on the technical side, streaming, always on, behind the cameras or where you have to be. Then Nonkosi Chilwane For me, she's like a sister and a mother. I don't know how to explain her, but thank you for being so an inspiration for us and to come up with wonderful ideas how we can build social cohesion at CPUT and really to transform the stereotyping and biases that many of us still have. And then my lady there in the back, Busi Lukide, she's the stakeholder coordinator in the Office of the Vice-Chancellor for just being everywhere where she's needed and even more than that. Now, in reflecting a bit, and I promise you I'm not going to be very long, VC, thanks for, and I've mentioned it, reminding us again also and of listening about culture, languages, that what makes us Africans. And thanks for reminding us again about those beautiful proverbs and values in our Vision 2030. I think we must actually make more of that if we can. And while the VC was talking about Ubuntu, etc., and he mentioned the issue that it's not, it's time to act and to lead, not talk anymore. I remember an African proverb which says, "A roaring lion kills no game." And that's so true. A lion can roar, and he can roar as much as he wants, but that's not going to say he's going to kill the game. And that is what we need, people that are willing to tackle issues, difficult conversations, how uncomfortable they even may be. And I think there's still a long way to go. Prof Sesanti, you said something which even in my whole career, when I was traveling, I was so acute aware of, and that is the so-called inferiority complex that we have in Africa. And it's time that we step out of that inferior complex and know that we are just as good, if not better. I want to reiterate, even not better, because our values, our roots are so deep, and I don't always think we appreciate it ourselves. There's nothing that we can actually learn from the Western world and Europe, which we don't know and which we cannot play a leading role in. We must be proud of our identities and our cultures and our languages. I happen to speak isiXhosa kancinci. So I've really tried to getting involved in African languages. I think one of the books that meant a lot to me is the book of Credo Mutwa, Indaba My Children. I think for me, that was one of the books I've read it actually twice, because for me it was just so part of understanding so much more about the African identities. Then the issue of claiming our African universities. And the one thing that really got to me this afternoon is the difference between to be an African university and a university in Africa. That was so well said. And you know what? Other people cannot make it happen for us. We must take the ownership. We must give the meaning to it. We must dream about it and give impetus to what we think and truly African university is. No one else is going to do that for us. We also need to restore, maintain, and develop the memory bank of African history which you refer to. The values, the histories, the cultures of Africa is so rich that we need to relive it, so to speak. Then, Prof Sesanti, you reminded us about the strengths, and I've added this, the beauty, on the role of women in society. Women in Africa need to claim this space. It's for me, in my role where I work, to hear about a student being raped. It gets to me, and it's so saddened that we are still faced with that issue. And I think it's because women do not believe that they're not a position. They are a person in their own right and can stand up, and that their bodies do not belong to a community, and they must be proud of their identity. Lastly, let us all go home and inspire the communities which we live in, to celebrate Africa, be proud of Africa, contribute to Africa, and fall again in love with Africa. You can hear I'm a woman, I believe in love and falling in love. So with those words, Nkosi Sikelele, Africa, God bless our sons and daughters. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of our program. I do want to just clear house very quickly before we go. I have been asked by the institution to ask all those that are present to remain behind. Please not leave after we're done. There's a picture that still needs to be taken with everyone that is currently pregnant. All right, I think we'll be taking it here, but we'll clear that up a bit later on. From my side and to you at home, because I greeted you now, it is time for me also to say goodbye. But of course, I'm a talker, I'm a broadcaster. I must have a word also before I go. In these words, Prof, okanye masiqale ngesiXhosa. Ndifuna ukuthi Prof Sesanti, VC, ndivumeleni ndibeka abantu ityala. Ndifuna ukuthi kubantu abebekhona nawe umameleyo apho ukhoyo, unendlebe nje uvile. Unamehlo nje ubonile. Unomlomo nje unetyala. Ityala lakho lelokuba sithi hamba uyoxelela izizwe ngako konke okubonileyo apha nokuvileyo apha. I shall repeat in English once again. I've asked Prof Simphiwe, Prof Sesanti, and the Vice Chancellor to lay a charge to each and every one of you that has been present here, whether online or live, that because you have ears, you have heard, and because you've got eyes, you have seen, because you have a mouth, you are now charged with going forth and sharing what you've heard and seen here today. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been an absolute pleasure. Please do enjoy the rest of your day.